In this lecture, we'll begin looking at the end of the Middle Ages during the Gothic period. In the last lecture, we talked about how Europe is coming together, more powerful, stronger monarchs are control of larger kingdoms. They talked about the travel throughout Europe becomes a little bit easier, a little bit safer. We started talking about the pilgrimages, people going to specific churches to see certain saints. And so it's like all these things are starting to come together, as well as the influence of Islam that we'll talk about in a second. So here we have the English and the French fall in battle from the Bayeux Tapestry. Basically tells the story of William the Conqueror during the Norman conquest of England. And so that was one of the things that happens that helps to bring this sort of stability. When you have the stability, you get better exchange of information, better exchange of ideas, and as well as better financing. So here's kind of a look at things that are going on in Europe. Of course, there's the Holy Roman Empire that we talked about. And France. Technically, France is kind of divided up between Aquitaine, the Ile-de-France, which is sort of the center part, and Normandy and Burgundy. So France really isn't quite united at this time. Also, most of Spain is under the control of the Islamic Moors. And speaking of Islam, so here's kind of a brief mini lecture over Islam. So of course, Islam coming from present-day Saudi Arabia with Muhammad, and it spreads through the Middle East over into today's Afghanistan and Pakistan, across northern Africa, and up into Spain. And there was some time where it was slowly sort of inching up into France. So one of the things that the Islamic people did, unlike the Christians who destroyed everything that did not meet or fit into the Christian doctrine, Islam, they looked at they were a little more picky. They looked at some things that they held on to, especially mathematics and geometry, and they used that and excelled with engineering, and that sort of what helps get into the Gothic period, as well as philosophy and literature and things like that. So as Islam is spreading across North Africa and up into Spain, it's starting to funnel back into mainland Europe. So it's slowly but surely, the Dark Ages. There's some argument that with the Carolingian, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, that's when things really start to change. A lot of information starts to come back into Europe. So briefly looking at Islam and some of their architecture. So here we have the mosque, and the mosque is based on Muhammad's home, where there was a courtyard with a covered walkway around it to the open area, the courtyard, kind of a meet and greet gathering place, and then the second part, the covered area, that's for the area of worship. Uh, and on the outer walls, you can see the buttressing going on. Again, the buttressing is the external supports to help hold the walls up. Uh, and the inside of the Great Mosque in Cordoba in Spain, it's a mosaic, and it's actually, they learned a lot of the mosaic techniques from the Byzantines, the exchange in between these two different cultures. So this is sort of a wonderful example of, when looking at the art of Islam, Islam, like Judaism, they're very strict about image making, especially when it comes to religious imagery. Uh, it's very hard to find examples of religious imagery coming from Islam because it's, of course, forbidden. So they put their image making in other areas. So there are three main types of images that you see, or image making that you would see. One is the script, the calligraphy. You kind of see the calligraphy going around the bottom of the dome there. Of course, that would be coming from the Quran, the word of Allah. And one of the others is sort of this vegetative or natural vining patterns or imagery, sort of the natural world. And then the other is the geometric. Like I said, when Islamic cultures started to obtain a lot of the like Greek and Persian, the mathematics and geometry, it's like they really kept on to that and they really ran with it and mixed it into their imagery. So just another example of a mosque. And this one, wanting to point out the pointed arch, that becomes a big key thing when we get into the Gothic period. It's in the front of the mosque, kind of hard to see, but again, it's plain to see the geometric patterns in there. But there's the script and the floral patterns as well on the front of it. One of the other things is a fountain in the middle. And sort of another thing is kind of the play with lights and shadows. Some of the Islamic architects, though, one of the things that they like to do is sort of mix all these different elements. A wonderful example of that is the Court of the Lions in Granada in Spain. And so here we have, like I was saying, the plates play with lights and shadow, adding in these water features. So adding in all these other elements to the architecture, thinking more of just, a building that needs to be there, but there's all these other effects. You get with the water, the water features, the sort of bubbling, trickling sound that it gives to the experience of it. So the Islamic architects, they really thought a lot more than just having a building. That Some other quick examples. So the book, so we have the one page from the Quran. You could make comparisons to the Gospel of Daro that we looked at, very ornate, very decorative. Uh, and then on the right, uh, while there is, imagery, it's not religious. So, coming from the Quran, strictly, the calligraphy, the text, as well as, fine, geometric patterns and stuff going around the outside, as well as, the vegetative plant motifs designs as well. And so the one on the right, the image, uh, it, since it is secular, it's not of religious nature, it's okay to portray people. Um, and one of the interesting things about Islam is that they prefer sort of the flat picture plane, where there would have been contact with Western artists, at this time that this image was created. So there would have been, linear perspective and all this other stuff that artists were using in the West, but for whatever reason, Islam kind of sticks to their tradition of the flattened picture plane, so they rely on where things are placed in the picture plane to give the idea of depth, and also, a little bit of hierarchical scale that they use as well. And then lastly, the arts of the daily lives. So lamp from Dome of the Rock, uh, one of the most holiest places for Islam, where Muhammad gave his final sermon before he ascended into heaven. Also where Abraham first heard the voice of God, and uh, other events. So anyway, so like the prayer rug, these sort of everyday items, they become important because of the lack of image making. Uh, so these are, much more precious, highly regarded items. So we have a oil lamp that would light up the Dome of the Rock. And again, you can see the geometric and the vegetative plant motif. They're actually kind of mixed in the geometric and the plant-like patterns, as well as the script. So they emphasize certain other objects and because of the lack of image making. So getting into the Gothic period. So on the right, Saint Etienne that we looked at, the cathedral in Normandy, round arches. So the Romanesque style, really thick walls, tiny windows. And from floor to ceiling, it's 66 feet. On the left is the interior of Saint Denis Cathedral in Paris. It's the first full Gothic cathedral, built by Abbot Suger. He worked on the designs and all that, helped with the planning and all that. And basically, when you get to the Gothic period, saints are a big thing, and as I like to put it, Christianity for a long time was kind of shut up, do as you're told, uh, and God is too busy for you, so we have to have these saints. If you want to have any type of salvation, you have to go to pray to the saint. The saint goes and talks to God. As a mortal, you and God, you do not talk. God's far too busy for you. So getting into the Gothic period, that starts to change where it's more sort of using the language, okay, God knows who you are. He's still pretty busy, so you still need the saint as a middleman, but he knows all about you. And so part of the idea was to create this building so that you could feel this presence of God. And as it said, the Abbot Suger's idea of creating the presence of God is by having the light, these massive, massive stained glass windows to flood the interior of this building so that you could actually, feel and experience the presence of God, even though you still had to go pray to the saint. So that was always the big thing of the Gothic period. It's the height of the cult of saints, going on all these pilgrimages to see these different saints. So again, to go back over, how the Gothic comes in, the stable kingdoms. With stable kingdom, you get exchange of information, ideas. Again, the Islamic occupation of Spain, when they were in control of Spain, this information flowing back into Europe, just the whole sort of changing of ideology and theology of Christianity, introducing the geometry and mathematics and engineering, so you get the pointed arch, and as well as the powerful, more stable kingdoms, also, better cash flow. So that's sort of, what leads up to the Gothic period. And so looking at Chartres Cathedral, in France. Technically, it's Notre Dame. As I mentioned before, they have the veil of the Virgin as their holy relic, the veil that Mary wore during the time of the crucifixion of Christ. Sort of the legend goes that somehow Mary Magdalene came into possession of it, and she left Jerusalem, when after the crucifixion and everything kind of fell apart for a little bit. She ended up in France, or I guess back then it was Gaul, and she, married into the royal, one of the Gaulish royal families. And so that's, the story of how they came in possession of the veil of the Virgin. So going over some of the numbers here real quick. It is, from west to east, 430 feet. North to south, 105 feet. But when you get to the transepts, it's 151 feet. The nave is, the interior of it is 121 feet, and the nave, not including the side aisles, is, by 54 feet, covering, 117,060 square feet. Bell towers, the northwest is 371 feet. It's the actual full Gothic design. The southwest tower is only 344 feet. It is the Romanesque design. And so if you look at the building years there, 1134 to 1260, not a typo. So these churches took many, many years. Some of the times they would go bankrupt. Other times, the normal building basically kind of spring through fall. Once in the fall, once you started to see signs of frost, that's when you would quit the actual building. Otherwise, your mortar could freeze and be compromised, and your walls and stuff start falling apart, and that's never good for anybody. But they would still be shaping stones and working on the glass, and there was still work going on during the winter, but they just weren't doing the actual construction. And then springtime, once the last hard freeze, once all that was done, then you would start building again. So when you only have about 7, 8 months of the year to actually build, that kind of puts a damper on it. So here's the floor plan, basic cruciform. So starting at the two bell towers in the west, going through the nave. There in the middle is the crossing where the nave and transept meet, and then the choir is the eastern part. And then off the choir is the ambulatory, the kind of round area with radiating chapels. So that's where you would have, if your family was really wealthy, you could pay for a chapel so that your family could be buried in there, or other saints would be in there. Oftentimes these would have, as I refer to, a heavy-hitting saint. So the veil of the Virgin, Mary's veil, that's their big holy relic. Then they might have a couple of other saints that or have closer ties to the area. And then also, like I said, families would be could be buried in there. And moving on to the interior, so looking in the nave, looking up to the clerestory. So just kind of give you an idea, the lower part of the nave, the windows you see there, those are really 26, 30 feet high. So, they're about tall as a two-story house. The upper ones in the clerestory there, those are, 40, 50 feet high. So about a, 4 or 5 story building that those would be tall as. So being inside, a Christian church, obviously most the images would be of a Christian nature. Various stories of the Bibles would be in there. Other ways that the church would make money, all of the guilds would get together. So like all the blacksmiths would get together, or all the millers, the guys that would grind up the grain, or the farmers, they would all get together and purchase a window, basically. And oftentimes it would be an image or the story of the patron saints for them. Basically, if you really get into Catholicism, sort of each occupation out there has a patron saint. So, and then looking at the door jambs, the entryways. So the west, pretty cookie cutter, pretty formulaic looking. So basically they're Romanesque style. On the right, the south transept door jambs, they're from the Gothic. They're more natural. So sort of as the idea you're shifting from, God being too busy, all that sort of stuff, the change of the Christian doctrine and everything, so the way they were making images started to change as well. So they're more natural, they're more representational. Each statue is pretty individual looking. Whereas the Romanesque ones are pretty, like I said, formulaic and cookie cutter looking. It's almost like you could tell that one person, you know, carved all four of them because they're all pretty similar. We can tell which one is not a man because it doesn't have a beard. Other than that, they're almost identical. Uh, the ones on the right where they're all individual. The knight there with his sword, hanging down, that weight. You can sort of see and understand the weight of the sword hanging off his clothes there. And just the weight of the clothing with the clergy. So much more natural, much more representational, getting a little more realistic. And of course, the rose windows and lancet. Uh, Always a good place for family trees, basically, what happens with a lot of them. So the rose windows, the round window, the lancets are the ones below it. Again, this whole thing together is like 50, 60 feet. Massive, massive windows. Finally, these churches are filled with all this light, with the whole idea of, now God is actually, come down, being present in these buildings. So filling it with light, filling it with the presence of God, made possible, by, like I said, the stronger, powerful monarchs, stable kingdoms. With stability, you get better information flowing, the changing of the Christian doctrine because of the philosophy and the engineering that's coming in from the Islamic Moors in Spain, and then money also being another pivotal part in it all. So finally, looking at some paintings, here we have the Cimabue, which is pretty typical of the Gothic style. And so the Duccio in Giotto, as the shift getting into the pre-Renaissance or proto-Renaissance, depending on who you talk to. Cimabue's pretty cookie cutter, formulaic looking type image. It's almost like you got this one standard image for Christianity. Let's take Mary off and put Saint Bartholomew up there, and we'll put some lesser saints there on the bottom. Angels are on the side. All right, that's we need a image for Saint James. Well, let's just take Bartholomew out, drop James in. We're good. It pretty formulaic. So the Duccio, the one there in the middle, Christ entering Jerusalem. One of the things that always kind of made me wonder, when I started to become aware of this idea of historical accuracy, and that's a big thing now where movies and TV shows will get railed on because, oh, that's not historical accurate. This wasn't true. That's not true. That's not the way it looked. Well, if you're, looking at it, looking at the architecture, it's like that's kind of a interesting Jerusalem. They got a nice round arch and some, sort of Romanesque and Gothic buildings back there. What's going on there? Why is Jesus going into this town that's like mine? That's basically what Duccio was doing. He's trying to set up this appearance to Jerusalem so it feels just like your town, your city, so that this, event from the Bible is not this far off distant place, but it's here. It's our town. It's our city. There's no difference between Jerusalem and where I live. They're almost the same place. And then Giotto is just, his is much more of a natural type type setting, for the lamentation. When Jesus was taken down off the cross after the crucifixion was over, handed over to Mary and his followers as they're trying to do what they can before the sun goes down and they have to quit working and go home. So if you were to, like reading the Bible, take all the different stories there, the descriptions of the Lamentations, how is it described? How do you think it would appear? So it's, Giotto is trying to make this more realistic and natural appearance to this biblical story. So that's it. Next lecture, we'll get into the Renaissance. Don't forget to post in the discussion and reply to 2 students.